Nour El-Mansouri arrived in California chasing a dream, and Calder Rowan was the man who turned that dream into a deadly trap. Nour El-Mansouri was only 21 years old when she stepped off a long flight into California, carrying 2 suitcases and a future she believed she controlled. She came from Rabat, Morocco, raised in a modest household where education was seen as the safest path to success. Her family described her as disciplined and careful, someone who avoided trouble and followed rules. Winning a student visa felt like a victory not just for Nour, but for everyone who supported her dream. To them, California represented opportunity, safety, and growth. At first, Nour lived exactly the life she promised. She enrolled in a private college focused on digital media and marketing. She rented a small room near campus, used public transportation, and spent long hours in libraries and cafes. Her social media showed sunsets, notebooks, and quiet corners of the city. Everything looked ordinary. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing hinted at secrets. Slowly, small changes appeared. Nour began posting photos from expensive locations that did not match a student budget. Rooftop pools, luxury hotels, and high-end restaurants appeared on her feeds. She wore designer clothing and carried items far beyond what her part-time campus job could afford. When classmates asked, she explained it as freelance work and networking opportunities tied to her studies. Her answers sounded reasonable. No one pushed further. Her family back home noticed the changes too, but from a distance they felt reassuring. Nour looked happy, confident, and successful. She sent money home more often than expected. She talked about future plans and possible business ideas. To her parents, this was proof that their sacrifice was worth it. They did not know that Nour was beginning to live 2 different lives at once. Behind her carefully managed image, Nour spent more time online than before. Her phone activity increased late at night. She used encrypted apps and private accounts unknown to her friends. Her email history showed deleted threads and short-lived contacts. Investigators would later say this was the period when Nour crossed an invisible line. What began as ambition slowly turned into risk. Her academic performance started to change. Assignments were submitted late, attendance became irregular. Professors noticed her distraction, but nothing serious enough to raise alarms. She still passed her courses. She still appeared focused when needed. Nour was skilled at maintaining balance, at least on the surface. There were also unexplained trips, weekend flights booked suddenly and canceled just as quickly. Rideshare records showed long drives outside the city, often at night. Nour told friends she was attending workshops or meeting potential clients. These explanations blended easily into the culture of hustle surrounding young students in California. No one questioned the pattern. What made Nour vulnerable was not recklessness, but isolation. She had no close family nearby and few deep friendships. She trusted digital connections more than physical ones. Her world existed through screens, messages, and carefully chosen images. That isolation created space for influence, manipulation, and promises that felt personal but were never fully real. By the end of her first year, Nour was no longer just a student trying to succeed. She was someone carrying information, expectations, and pressure she did not share with anyone. Her life looked brighter than ever online, yet her real circumstances were becoming unstable. The foundation beneath her success was thin, fragile, and quietly cracking. This was the beginning. Before the money, before the secret relationship, and before the crime, there was a young woman who believed she had found a faster way forward. She did not know that every step she took closer to comfort was also pulling her toward a danger she could not see and a future she would never reach. Calder Rowan did not live like most wealthy men in California. He owned property along the coast, held shares in successful tech companies, and moved millions of dollars each year. Yet very few people could recognize his face. He avoided conferences, media interviews, and public records whenever possible. His name appeared only in business filings and offshore documents. To the outside world, Calder barely existed. His wealth came early. In his 30s, he invested in small technology firms before they exploded into global platforms. When his profits multiplied, he learned how to disappear behind them. He hired firms to manage his identity, used shell companies to hold assets, and trusted only systems, never people. Control mattered more to him than attention. Calder's private life followed the same pattern. He did not maintain long-term friendships or public relationships. His social circle existed online, built through invitation-only platforms that promised discretion. These spaces allowed wealthy individuals to meet people outside their usual world, with minimal background checks and limited accountability. It was there that Nour El-Mansouri entered his orbit. Investigators later traced their first digital connection to a closed networking app marketed toward ambitious students and private investors. Profiles were curated, polished, and often misleading. Nour presented herself as a gifted international student with business insight and cultural awareness. Calder appeared as a mentor figure, offering guidance and access rather than romance. At least, that was how it began. Their communication intensified quickly. Data records showed daily contact, often lasting for hours. Nour's calendar filled with sudden gaps that aligned with Calder's travel movements. Flights booked under different names followed similar routes. Hotel reservations overlapped. The pattern suggested planning, not coincidence. Money entered the picture quietly. Small transfers arrived first, labeled as consulting fees and project support. Then larger amounts followed, routed through accounts registered to temporary companies. Nour's spending increased at the same pace. What looked like luxury was actually evidence of dependency forming beneath the surface. Calder was careful. He never transferred funds directly from accounts tied to his real name. Every transaction passed through layers of digital distance. Investigators later described it as a maze designed to confuse, delay, and erase responsibility. Nour became part of that system without fully understanding its scale. A major twist emerged when authorities uncovered Calder's history with other young students. Similar financial patterns appeared years earlier, connected to different names and cities. In every case, the relationship followed the same arc: attention, support, secrecy, then sudden silence. Nour was not the first. She was simply the one who stayed too long. What made Nour different was access. Calder began sharing sensitive business material with her. Encrypted files, draft proposals, and internal data moved through her devices. Her role shifted from companion to asset. She attended meetings using false credentials and gathered information others could not. This was no longer personal, it was operational. At the same time, Calder's behavior grew more erratic. His financial activity spiked. Risky transfers appeared in short bursts. Internal alerts flagged unusual movements. Someone was watching him more closely than before. Whether he sensed exposure or betrayal remains unclear, but the pressure was building. Nour's life became tightly linked to Calder's decisions. Her visa status, income, and safety all depended on a man who valued control above loyalty. The secrecy that once felt exclusive now felt heavy. Digital evidence suggested she began saving copies of files, possibly as leverage or protection. By the time their relationship reached its peak, it was no longer clear who was using whom. Calder had built a system where affection and exploitation looked identical. Nour stood at the center of it all, holding pieces of a puzzle that could destroy him or trap her forever. The shadow around Calder Rowan was no longer just his choice. It was closing in, and Nour was standing directly beneath it, unaware of how little room there was left to escape. By the time Nour El-Mansouri entered her second year in California, her life no longer followed a normal routine. Her days were fragmented, driven by alerts, deadlines, and instructions that did not come from her school. Financial records showed constant movement. Money arrived, disappeared, then returned in altered amounts. Some transfers were split into dozens of smaller payments, sent to accounts that existed only briefly before being closed. Nour was no longer just receiving money, she was managing it. Her digital footprint grew complicated. She used multiple devices, each with different login identities. Cloud backups were turned off. Location data was manually altered. Investigators later confirmed that someone had taught her these methods step by step. This was not curiosity. It was training. Nour had become a tool inside a system designed to hide activity in plain sight. The scheme began to reveal itself through documents discovered months later. Draft investment proposals were found on Nour's laptop, written under her name but aimed at Calder-Rowan's competitors and partners. These documents contained insider information that only someone close to Calder could access. The proposals were designed to extract funds, data, or influence by presenting Nour as an independent operator with privileged access. On paper, she looked ambitious. In reality, she was being positioned as a shield. Her academic life continued to decay. She missed exams and failed to respond to university warnings. Still, she remained enrolled, protected by tuition payments that arrived early and in full. The school never questioned the source. Nour's legal status stayed intact, even as her personal stability collapsed. Surveillance footage later placed her at meetings with individuals who had no connection to her studies. These encounters happened in parking garages, short-term rentals, and office spaces leased for a single day. She stayed briefly and left without visible exchanges. The lack of physical evidence suggested digital transactions or information transfers. Nour was no longer acting alone, but she was also not in control. A critical turning point came when Nour began copying files. Forensic analysis showed duplicated data hidden inside personal folders and disguised as class projects. The material included transaction histories, encrypted ledgers, and internal communications linked to Calder's financial operations. This suggested fear. Either Nour realized she was disposable, or she believed she needed protection if the system collapsed. At the same time, outside pressure intensified. Financial institutions flagged suspicious patterns tied indirectly to Calder's network. Regulatory interest increased. Unknown third parties attempted to access Nour's accounts, triggering security alerts. Someone else wanted what she had. The scheme was no longer contained. Nour's behavior changed sharply. She canceled travel plans, avoided certain locations, and stopped responding to messages for hours at a time. Her online presence went silent. Friends later described her as anxious and distracted, constantly checking her surroundings. The confidence once displayed online vanished completely. What makes this chapter disturbing is the realization that Nour was trapped between forces far larger than herself. On one side was Calder-Rowan, a man with resources, experience, and an established pattern of control. On the other side were unknown entities monitoring the same financial streams. Nour stood in the middle, holding information that carried value and danger in equal measure. The scheme itself was no longer just about money. It had become about containment. Every move Nour made was watched by someone, whether she knew it or not. The role she played could not be abandoned without consequences. Leaving meant exposure. Staying meant deeper involvement. By the end of this phase, Nour was no longer acting as a student, a partner, or even a participant. She had become a liability, and in systems built on secrecy and profit, liabilities are not protected. They are removed. The scam had reached a point where someone would have to disappear. The only question left was who would survive it. The final night began quietly, with no sign that anything was about to end. Nour El-Mansouri left her apartment after sunset, carrying only her phone, her wallet, and a small backpack. Security cameras showed no hesitation in her movements. She locked the door behind her and walked toward a waiting ride. The destination entered into the app was vague, pointing toward the coast but not a specific address. It was a trip she had taken before, one that never raised suspicion. Her phone activity showed brief bursts of encrypted data during the drive, followed by long silences. Location tracking placed her moving farther away from populated areas, toward winding roads where streetlights disappeared. The driver account used that night was later found to be registered under false information. By the time investigators tried to trace it, the profile no longer existed. The last digital signal from Nour came from a stretch of road overlooking the ocean. Her smartwatch recorded a sudden spike in movement, followed by an abrupt stop. The device continued to function for several minutes before going offline. That data would later contradict the initial theory of an accident. When Nour did not return home, her absence went unnoticed at first. She had canceled classes before. She had disappeared from social spaces before. It was only after 2 days of silence that concern began to spread. Her phone remained unreachable. Her bank accounts showed no activity. Something had broken the pattern completely. Her body was discovered at the bottom of a steep ravine by a maintenance crew. The scene suggested a fall, but details did not align. The slope showed drag marks inconsistent with a single impact. Tire tracks near the edge did not match Nour's known travel records. There were no personal items scattered the way they would be after an accidental fall. Everything felt placed, not lost. Authorities initially leaned toward a tragic mistake, a young student, stress, a late-night drive, but the evidence resisted simplicity. The medical report showed injuries that occurred before the fall. The timeline did not match natural movement. Someone had intervened. As investigators focused on Nour's final hours, Calder Rowan vanished. His primary residence was empty. Security systems had been disabled days earlier. A private jet registered to one of his shell companies departed California the same night Nour disappeared. The flight plan listed a destination that was never reached. After that, the trail fractured into international airspace and false registrations. Financial activity exploded in the hours following Nour's death. Accounts connected to Calder were drained, closed, or rerouted. Digital assets moved rapidly across borders. Servers wiped themselves remotely. The system he had built for control activated fully, erasing traces with precision. It looked like preparation, not panic. What investigators found most unsettling was the timing. Nour's devices showed attempts to access encrypted files shortly before she left her apartment. Some files were opened but not transferred. Others were accessed remotely after her death. Someone was searching for something she carried, either physically or digitally. The night did not end with her death. It extended into a coordinated disappearance. Calder's identity dissolved across continents, leaving behind empty properties and unanswered questions. Anyone connected to him through business or social channels reported sudden silence. Phones disconnected, emails bounced back. It was as if a network had shut itself down. Nour's death marked the collapse of secrecy into violence. Whatever balance had existed between control and risk was gone. The ravine became the final location where that balance failed. Whether Nour was silenced for what she knew or removed as a threat that could no longer be managed remains unresolved. What is certain is that the events of that night were not random. They were the result of months of pressure, surveillance, and fear, converging into a single decision. Nour left her apartment believing she was stepping into another controlled exchange. She never returned because control had finally turned against her. In the months following Nour El-Mansouri's death, investigators worked through fragments rather than answers. What remained of her life existed in broken data trails, partial records, and devices that had been wiped too clean to be accidental. The case quickly crossed borders, drawing in financial regulators and cybercrime units, but progress moved slowly. Every discovery led to another locked door. The most significant breakthrough came from a backup Nour did not know existed. A university server had automatically saved older versions of her coursework, including hidden data embedded inside media files. Within those files were fragments of encrypted ledgers and transaction maps. Though incomplete, they confirmed that Calder Rowan had been running coordinated financial manipulation through multiple identities. Nour's role was clearer now. She had been positioned as a buffer between him and exposure. What shocked authorities most was the scale. The scam stretched across several countries and involved shell companies that recycled money through student visas, temporary businesses, and private investments. Nour's name appeared repeatedly, not as the mastermind, but as the visible endpoint. If the scheme collapsed, she would have taken the blame. Her death removed both a witness and a risk. Despite this evidence, Calder Rowan remained a ghost. His passports were fake, his biometric records were compromised. Every sighting led to another dead end. Experts concluded that he had prepared for disappearance long before Nour ever arrived in California. Her death was not the beginning of his escape, it was simply the moment he chose to activate it. For Nour's family, the investigation brought little comfort. They received her belongings months later, carefully cataloged and stripped of anything digital. The official cause of death remained contested, buried under legal language and jurisdictional limits. No arrest was made, no charges were filed. The case remained open but inactive. Public attention faded quickly. Without a suspect in custody, the story lost momentum. Nour became a statistic in international crime databases, her life summarized in brief reports that failed to capture her complexity. To the system, she was evidence. To her family, she was an absence that never closed. What makes this case unsettling is not just the lack of justice, but the clarity of intent. Nour was not caught in random violence. She was eliminated at the moment she became dangerous to someone more powerful. The scam did not fail, it adapted. The network survived by sacrificing its weakest point. Years later, traces of Calder's financial patterns appeared in unrelated investigations under different names. The structure was familiar, but never provable. It suggested that the man Nour trusted continued operating, protected by distance, money, and systems designed to erase accountability. The final truth of the case rests in a quiet realization. Nour El-Mansouri did not die because of love, nor solely because of greed. She died because secrecy demands silence, and silence is enforced when control is threatened. Her story exposes how easily ambition can be exploited and how disposable a life can become when it stands between power and exposure. The documentary ends not with resolution, but with a warning. In a world where identities can be rebuilt and crimes can dissolve across borders, justice does not always arrive. Sometimes, all that remains is the record of what happened and the responsibility to remember the person who paid the price for knowing too much.